All right, hello everyone. We are going to move on to talk about dissolved gases in soils. And again, a lot of this was first put together by Matt, and I just added a little bit more to it and re recorded it. So, by the end of this video, you should be able to describe where and how dissolved gases exist in soil, and describe how gas concentration in soils can supersaturate and the consequences of this process. So, gases in soil. So, soil, as we all know, is very complex and highly variable. So, in any given soil, we'll just take this as an example. We have some amount of space filled with mineral material. We might have some amount of organic matter. We might have some amount of water, and the rest of this is filled with free gases. So the relative proportions of these are obviously going to change depending on the density of our soil. If we're dealing with a super dense soil, we might have way more mineral material. In places where we have a lot of productivity, we might have a lot more organic matter. And then, of course, over the course of a day or a year, these relative proportions between air and other gases in that air and water will trade off depending on moisture status. So we can have gases just as free gases in the pore space, or we can have gases that are dissolved in the water that is taking up the rest of that pore space in that soil. So the major gases in soil are nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, of course, the main things that make up our atmosphere, and then are also produced by respiration and primary productivity. And then we can have other gases that are somewhat important in our soils, like nitrous oxide, methane, and ammonia gas. So that is where gases exist in the soil, and we need to start making sure that we're distinguishing between atmospheric gases and dissolved gases. So as a quick reminder of biology, was something we had a little bit of an introduction to at the very beginning of this class, but respiration, which is converting carbon to energy, produces CO2 and is most efficient when there's some amount of oxygen around. We generally breathe in oxygen and then respire out CO2. So if we don't have much available oxygen, we tend to look to other metabolic pathways. So as such, respiration is going to consume oxygen. And if we're working in an isolated environment, something that can't freely exchange with the atmosphere, respiration can consume all of the oxygen in that isolated environment. So this causes a cascade of biogeochemical and other redox reactions. And in future modules, we will spend plenty of time talking about redox. So this video is some research that Matt was doing working in a lagoon, I believe in Venice. So this is just showing he had some plots here that you can see outlined, and he put some dissolved oxygen sensors. Because this is a lagoon, they get daily tides. So this is looking as we have water coming in here and swamping these soils, what is happening. So they were measuring dissolved oxygen in those plots and comparing treatments across different plant types and different vegetation, and what that meant for gas concentrations in those soils. So here he's showing the results of that, where he has two different plant types and what the oxygen concentrations were for those plant types. And what we can see basically is for these stands during the day, only when we have growing plants that we can get to the point where we produce some amount of dissolved oxygen here. So these stands still aren't producing like we were seeing with supersaturation in water. We're only seeing oxygen contents of, between 10 and 15%, but we still are producing dissolved oxygen here on a daily cycle. So root respiration and primary productivity occurring in these soil environments is a real thing and does make a huge difference for our soil environments. So another example of a study is showing that it is possible to get to supersaturation, particularly with CO2 in soils. So this is looking at soil water potential and soil water content. So this measure of how much water we have in our soil and comparing that to CO2 concentrations in these soils. So we can see, particularly when we're working in warm, wet conditions, when we have relatively high soil moisture, we can produce a lot of CO2, a lot of respiration can happen, and we can supersaturate our soils with respect to CO2. And this really matters because when we're producing a lot of CO2 and that gets dissolved in our water, we know that we're producing a lot of carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid is very important as a weathering product because we're making more, is really important for weathering because we are making more acidic soils, which tends to weather a lot of mineral material in our soils. The other thing that I want to point out is gases produced in soils can have huge implications for the streams downstream of those soils. So this study just has a nice little conceptual diagram where we might have some amount of CO2 and carbon coming into a section of stream of interest. We might have some coming out of that section of stream of interest, but we also have contributions from the soil itself, and then we have some amount of flux to the atmosphere. So if we look in this little box, we have CO2 getting transferred when we have a rain event and water flowing downhill. It's going to mobilize whatever is in the soil, including dissolved CO2, some amount of dissolved organic carbon, and some amount of methane that's produced in the soils. Those are going to go through the hyporheic zone, that interface between the stream and the terrestrial environment or the groundwater, and some transformations might occur. So for instance, this DOC, this dissolved organic carbon, might be consumed and converted to CO2. Same with methane. We might have some methane that gets converted to CO2. Either way, some of it's going to enter the stream and move downstream as a flux, and some of it will then return to the atmosphere through the stream network rather than through the soil itself. So what they found is looking at these different terrestrial carbon sources, the percent of total CO2 flux from the stream surface to the atmosphere. They found that CO2 sourced from the soil environments to the stream contributed, between 15 and 20% of total CO2 flux. And then methane contributed about 10% of total CO2 flux. But this DOC, this dissolved organic carbon that's coming from the landscape, is obviously a huge source of energy for organisms living in the stream, which then gets broken down and leaves the system as respired CO2. So of the total CO2 flux, we're showing that this study was showing that these terrestrial soil gases, including CO2 and methane, but also the actual DOC itself, is contributing a huge amount to the CO2 that's leaving our streams. So we really want to drive home this point that soil gases and what happens in the terrestrial environment can strongly impact productivity and what's happening in the stream environment and the gas flux from that stream environment. And this little figure over here is just to show that that is pretty consistent across streams. So even if you're moving into higher order, larger streams, you're still getting a lot of your total CO2 flux delivered from the terrestrial environment. So both freshwaters and soils have gases that can supersaturate. We can end up with really high CO2 concentrations in our soils, and this happens when the gas exchange velocity is much slower than the production rate of that gas. True for both aquatic environments and terrestrial environments. So similarly, gases can be completely depleted in local environments with little or no gas exchange. So if we have a wetland environment that can't exchange gas between the atmosphere, we can become anoxic, where all oxygen can be consumed. Same with any microsite within a soil environment. If that microsite is not exchanging with the atmosphere, you can consume all your oxygen. And so this really dynamic concept, really dynamic system is a function of the gas flux itself, which we talked a lot about estimating gas flux in aquatic environments in the previous lecture. So that's all I have for you guys, and we will kick it off with looking at modeling dissolved oxygen in the next lecture.